The Supreme Court chamber was completely still. No rustling papers, no quiet whispers, just silence. Everyone's attention was fixed on Justice Amy Coney Barrett as she leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the woman standing at the podium. It was Pam Bondi, Attorney General, facing the highest court in the country in a case that could change how power is shared between states and the federal government. Barrett didn't ease into the questioning. There was no warm-up. She cut, straight to the point. Her voice echoed through the chamber, clear and sharp. Your argument contradicts precedent in at least 3 major cases. Her tone wasn't just firm, it was dismissive, like she couldn't believe Bondi had even brought this argument to the court. She mentioned a case, Harrington v. Davis, and implied that Bondi clearly hadn't done her homework. You could feel the air shift. A few of the justices exchanged glances. Bondi didn't move, but you could sense the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was supposed to be a standard legal hearing, but now, it felt more like a trial by fire. A Supreme Court justice was calling her out right at the start of her argument, in front of the entire bench in a packed courtroom. Most people watching assumed Bondi was in trouble. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe the critics were right when they said she didn't have the background for a case this big. Barrett seemed to think so, and in that moment, it looked like this would be over before it began. But what happened next would completely change the direction of the hearing. No one in that courtroom expected the shift that was about to unfold, not even Justice Barrett. Before that tense moment in the courtroom, it's important to understand who these 2 women are and why their exchange mattered so much. Justice Amy Coney Barrett had built her career on discipline, deep knowledge of the law, and a clear way of thinking about the Constitution. She studied law at Notre Dame and later taught there. After that, she served as a federal judge on the 7th Circuit. When she was nominated to the Supreme Court, it was because of her reputation as a strict originalist, someone who believes the Constitution should be followed exactly as it was written. Whether people agreed with her or not, most respected her mind. She was known for asking tough questions and sticking to her principles. Pam Bondi came from a different path. She had been the Attorney General of Florida for 8 years, and the first woman to ever hold that position. Her background was more about fighting legal battles on the ground, prosecuting cases, dealing with real-world problems, not writing long articles on legal theory. After her time in office, she stayed in the public eye, working in politics and private law. But she hadn't spent much time in the world of the Supreme Court, and that's what made some people nervous. When she was chosen to argue this huge case in front of the justices, some legal experts quietly wondered if she was the right person for the job. This wasn't just any case. The case was called Federation of States versus Department of Commerce, and it was a big deal. 17 states had come together to challenge new rules from the federal government. These rules affected how states handled things like land use and taxes, areas many believed should be under state control, not federal. At the heart of the fight was a simple but serious question. Who gets to decide what? The federal government or the individual states? It wasn't just about rules on paper. It was about power. If the states lost, the federal government would gain more control over how states manage their own land and money. If the states won, it could pull some power away from Washington and give it back to local governments. Either way, the outcome could shift how American government works for years to come. That's why Bondi's role mattered. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was standing up for nearly half the country's states. And sitting directly in front of her was a justice known for asking razor-sharp questions and not backing down. The courtroom had settled into its usual rhythm. Bondi began her argument calmly, laying out the state's case against the federal government's new regulations. Her voice was steady, her words clear. For a few minutes, everything seemed routine, until Justice Barrett cut in. Without warning, Barrett leaned forward again, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Miss Bondi," she said, "your argument contradicts established precedent in at least 3 major decisions. Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with Harrington versus Davis before bringing such theories before this court." It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. The tone wasn't curious or challenging in a respectful way. It was sharp, almost cold, like a professor catching a student making a basic mistake in front of the entire class. She wasn't just questioning Bondi's legal theory. She was questioning whether Bondi even belonged in that room. A quiet tension spread across the chamber. Bondi stopped mid-sentence. She didn't flinch, but she didn't speak right away either. For a split second, everything paused. The justices, the clerks, the gallery. Everyone was watching to see what she would do. Even the smallest reaction from Bondi would say a lot. Was she shaken? Was she ready? Barrett wasn't done. She followed up with more questions, mentioning 2 other cases that she claimed went against Bondi's argument. She pressed her point, clearly trying to box Bondi into a corner. From the outside, it looked like Barrett was laying a trap, and that Bondi had walked right into it. There was a quiet confidence in the way Barrett spoke, like she had already made up her mind about Bondi's argument and was just waiting to prove her wrong. And for a moment, it really did seem like Bondi was outmatched. This was the kind of moment that could make or break a case, or a career. Bondi didn't panic. She didn't rush to defend herself or stumble through a reply. Instead, she calmly adjusted the papers in front of her, looked up at Justice Barrett and said, "Thank you for that question, Justice Barrett." Her voice was steady, respectful, but confident. That simple response caught everyone's attention. It was clear she wasn't rattled. Without even glancing at her notes, Bondi began to explain why Harrington v. Davis actually supported her argument. She quoted directly from the opinion, focusing on a specific part of the ruling that many had overlooked. She pointed out that the court in Harrington had only allowed federal regulation in cases where the government's interest clearly outweighed the state's right to self-govern. "That's not the case here," she said clearly. Then she brought up something even more surprising, a separate opinion by Justice Kavanaugh from the same case. It wasn't the majority opinion, but a special note that laid out a 3-part test to decide when federal power should be allowed to override state decisions. Bondi carefully walked through each part of that test, showing how the current case failed on key points. She wasn't just defending her position anymore. She was turning the law around and using it in her favor. And she wasn't done. Bondi then mentioned a case few people in the room had probably thought about that day. Westmoreland v. United States, a lower court decision not often discussed in Supreme Court arguments. But she made it matter. She explained how Westmoreland showed what happens when federal regulations overstep and put too much weight on states. She tied it back to her current case so smoothly that the shift in the courtroom was almost physical. Justice Sotomayor leaned in and asked a question, clearly intrigued. Bondi answered quickly without hesitation. She even pointed to a Supreme Court case where Westmoreland was cited in a footnote, just enough to make it relevant. Barrett, who had started the exchange, with clear doubt now looked more thoughtful. She didn't say anything right away, but her body language said a lot. The raised eyebrow, the quiet stillness. She hadn't expected this level of knowledge, or this kind of calm, controlled pushback. The energy in the courtroom had changed. What had started as a one-sided challenge was quickly turning into a serious back and forth between 2 legal minds on equal ground. Bondi didn't just know the law. She knew how to make it real. She started tying the cases she'd mentioned to everyday decisions that states have to make, like how they manage land or raise money through taxes. She wasn't speaking in theory anymore. She was showing how the law affects real people in real places. And it was working. You could tell the justices were following closely now, not just listening out of duty, but because they were genuinely interested in what she had to say. Then she brought up Nick v. Township of Scott. It wasn't just another case. It was a major one that had changed how property rights cases could be handled in federal court. Bondi used it to show that the Supreme Court had already moved away from some of the older rulings that Barrett had mentioned earlier, and she made it clear that Nick wasn't just similar. It had actually reversed parts of the decision Barrett was using to criticize her argument. That was a bold move, but Bondi backed it up with facts. What really shifted the mood in the room, though, was what she said next. Bondi pointed out that Justice Barrett herself had once written about this, issue when she was a judge on the Seventh Circuit. In one of her opinions, Barrett had said that when federal rules create conflicts with state laws, the courts should figure out which government actually has the main authority in that area. Bondi smiled slightly and said, "That thinking offers a helpful path forward in this case." Barrett's expression changed. This wasn't a lawyer fumbling under pressure anymore. This was someone who had not only studied the justice's work, but used it in a smart and respectful way to strengthen her own case. Then came the real test. Barrett gave Bondi a tricky, made-up situation, a complicated example involving state and federal laws pulling in opposite directions. It was the kind of question designed to trip someone up. But Bondi didn't pause. She calmly broke it down into 3 key ideas and explained how each one fit into the case. She even used rulings Barrett had written in the past to support her points. Barrett leaned back slightly, no longer trying to catch Bondi off guard. The look on her face had changed. She wasn't challenging Bondi anymore. She was listening. Bondi continued. Something unexpected happened. The rest of the court started leaning in. Justice Clarence Thomas, usually quiet during arguments, asked a direct question about the limits of federal authority. Bondi didn't miss a beat. She answered smoothly, pulling in a statement from Justice Gorsuch about how states should never become tools for carrying out federal orders. She wasn't guessing, she was quoting. It was clear she had studied every angle of this issue, and she was ready for whatever came next. Then Justice Elena Kagan jumped in. She's known for being sharp and detail-focused, and her question went deep into a previous ruling. Kagan brought up a possible conflict between what Bondi was arguing and what the court had said in another case about interstate commerce. Again, Bondi didn't hesitate. She explained the difference clearly and confidently, pointing out that the earlier case was about a completely different kind of federal power. She backed it up with a line from a concurring opinion by Justice Scalia, one that many had overlooked. But Bondi hadn't. She had even remembered a specific footnote from a past decision that supported her point. That detail turned heads. You could see it on the faces of the justices. They were no longer testing her. They were engaging with her, like they would with a fellow legal scholar. Every time a new question came, Bondi responded like she'd expected, it all along. She didn't dodge anything, she didn't speak in circles. She gave straight answers backed by real cases and smart reasoning. Even Justice Barrett, who had started the morning by calling Bondi out in front of everyone, had changed. Her posture. She wasn't staring Bondi down anymore. She was writing in her notebook, fast. Watching her, it looked less like she was planning her next challenge and more like she was learning something new. What had started as a one-sided test was now a real conversation, one where Bondi was holding her own, step by step, against some of the brightest legal minds in the country. After the exchange in the courtroom, the buzz didn't stop once the session ended. Inside the chambers, the justices discussed the case privately, and it quickly became clear that Justice Barrett had started to reconsider her earlier judgment. The conversation had clearly made an impact, and she was thinking more deeply about the points raised, especially Bondi's arguments. In the aftermath, Chief Justice Roberts granted Pam Bondi extra time to finish her argument. This was a rare gesture, signaling that her points were worth further consideration. Bondi's ability to hold the courtroom's attention and her clear, confident delivery had shifted the conversation in ways that weren't immediately expected. The extra time she was given allowed her to solidify her stance and further challenge the assumptions behind the case. Meanwhile, legal blogs went into overdrive, publishing pieces that ranged from insightful to analytical. One headline stood out: Bondi reshapes the federalism debate. Many bloggers praised her for framing the issue in a fresh and powerful way, highlighting how her argument could alter the landscape of future federalism cases. It wasn't just a win for Bondi, but a moment that caught the attention of those watching the broader implications of the case. Law professors also weighed in. They called the exchange between Barrett and Bondi a masterclass in constitutional argumentation. They praised Bondi's ability to clarify complex ideas and present them in a way that connected with both the justices and the wider public. Her approach brought clarity to a legal debate that had felt stuck in the weeds. Finally, in one of the court's rare internal conferences, Justice Barrett made a rare acknowledgement of the impact Bondi's argument had on her thinking. This moment of self-reflection was a departure from her usual demeanor and marked a shift in how she was approaching the case. It was clear that the exchange had made her rethink her original position, and it wasn't just a passing moment. It was the beginning of a deeper legal contemplation. In the end, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the states, with the majority opinion reflecting much of the framework that Pam Bondi had presented during the oral arguments. Her ideas, which seemed bold at the time, were now the foundation of the court's decision. In the years that followed, her approach to federalism came to be known as the Bondi test. Legal scholars and practitioners often referred to it as a landmark moment in constitutional law, one that shaped how future cases would be viewed and argued. Justice Barrett, in a rare move, wrote a concurring opinion that engaged directly with Bondi's arguments. She acknowledged how Bondi's insights had influenced her thinking and added depth to the majority opinion. This rare moment of agreement between a justice and an attorney, so clearly displayed in Barrett's written words, was seen as a significant shift in how the court viewed the role of attorneys in shaping its decisions. Barrett's concurring opinion didn't just stand as a formality. It demonstrated how a well-argued case can leave an imprint on even the most experienced justices. The media quickly picked up on the importance of the case, dubbing it the showdown that changed everything. News outlets and legal analysts discussed how this argument had shaken up long-held assumptions and brought a fresh perspective to the table. Bondi, once seen as a relative outsider, had now become a central figure in constitutional debates, with her analysis setting the tone for future discussions on federalism. Looking back on the case, the message was clear. True brilliance often comes from unexpected places. Bondi's performance was a reminder that in the world of law, the most powerful ideas can come from individuals who aren't necessarily the most famous or the most experienced, but who have the ability to think clearly and present their ideas with conviction. Years later, Bondi and Barrett appeared together at a legal conference. The two, once opponents in the courtroom, shared a moment of mutual respect. They acknowledged how their exchange had shaped their careers and praised each other's contributions to the case. The respect between them was clear, showing that, even in the adversarial world of the Supreme Court, moments of genuine admiration can emerge